Cool. Hello everyone. Today is 11th of July, and this is the OLM working group / triage meeting. So it looks like we have some items on the agenda filled up, but first on the agenda is milestone check-in. So we're at milestone 5. Typically, I think today or around this time is when we should be cutting a new release of we should be closing out milestone 5 and cutting a new release of operator controller. I've added I see that there's a few items in progress. So first of all, is everything on this board in the right place? I've added a new column that says code review so that we can clearly see which is in progress and which is in code review. Last time, I think we talked about this new issue about publishing documentation or starting a documentation site. So for example, I've put that in code review as an example. Are there any items over here that should be put in code review? Looks like most of it is DEPI tickets.
Well, I can talk for my issues, which is 231, 267, 268. And basically, we have some discussion around those yet, because all of them are one PR, which is half that, but we need to discuss if we want to go this route or we will scratch that or rework that.
Okay, so they are in progress. So we should probably be moving these to milestone 5, right? Are we okay with that? Sorry, milestone 6.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so I think we can do that offline. So we'll just probably have to create OLM B1 / milestone 6, create a new label, and then take the milestone 5 out so that they're in milestone 6.
I will move the others. Don't worry.
Okay. And we can create a new view for the milestone 6 so that we can close this milestone out and do a release of operator controller. We should probably have an issue every milestone that says cut a new release of milestone, cut a new release of operator controller, so that we can move that to done, and that signifies the end of the milestone. But we can do that for next milestone. Is there anything else that we want to talk about, at least in terms of this milestone? Okay.
Well, looks like sadly I cannot create labels or move actual ones, so someone will need to move.
Okay, yeah, we can do these offline. I think I've already created the milestone, the label, so you should be able to just add that label. So if you refresh that, yeah, so you should be able to do that. But yeah, we can move these to milestone 6 and cut a new release. Probably create a new show here to cut a new release. So that will be the end of milestone 5. And then the next item would be to talk about the idea generation for the next milestone, but then it looks like there are some other topics before we go to that. So first up on the item is Kevin talking about time-based releases. Maybe it falls into the same thing that we're talking about right now. Kevin, do you want to take over?
Yeah, that's it seems very relevant. So yeah, I posted in Slack yesterday. I am, and maybe I've missed it, but I am really looking for us to be maybe a little bit more strict about our process, doing exactly what we're doing right now in terms of like relabeling issues and updating the milestones and cutting releases. And also having a relationship between the actual release cut that we're doing for operator controller and how that relates to a specific milestone. I think Joe actually pointed out that the upward SDK is doing essentially what I'm more or less proposing. And so I guess I wanted to first maybe do a temperature check in terms of how folks feel about being more rigorous in our milestone planning and release process. And then also, I think, I don't know if Bryce, if you want to try to go through a little bit more detail about the operator SDK's process, but just kind of talk through maybe at a high level what that looks like. And then hopefully from that, we can come up to sort of like a general consensus, and then maybe I can, or somebody else on the call who want to, can write up a proposal for how we might go forward. So yeah, so I guess first of all, does anybody have any opinions on time-based, I don't know, like if it's a monthly release maybe or something along those lines? I think we probably need to figure out what those details would look like, but at like a high level, is there anybody who disagrees with the premise or has any thoughts about it?
I think we've already agreed on a premise that we'll be cutting a release every milestone, right? And is that not rigorous enough?
Well, so I guess like I'm looking at milestone 5 right now, right? And we closed milestone 4 sometime in May, and now we're talking about closing milestone 5 now, which is over 2 months ago. And I guess like why? Like why not make it so that we have a strict like monthly release, for example, to use a straw man?
I mean, that makes sense to me. The way that I was thinking about the milestones is, I think in my head, we've already established that each milestone is going to be 3 weeks, which is typically a sprint. And then I was under the impression, and that sounds like it was wrong based on what Kevin just said, that we are doing that. For example, we've started, my impression was that we had started milestone 5 3 weeks before. And now that we are at the end of those 3 weeks, now we are talking about moving these tickets out to a new milestone and closing this out and cutting a new release. If it was 2 months ago that we had cut the last release, that means that we had missed closing milestone 4 out when we should have. So we just need to make sure that in our agenda doc, or I think if we create an issue that says in 3 weeks, this should be closed out, and this is an issue to track the cutting of the next operator control release, it gives us a more of a structure to adhere to in terms of like, okay, 3 weeks is when we cut the release. Does that make sense?
That makes sense to me. And one thing that maybe Kevin is sort of hinting at is, and I don't know, Kevin, if you said this or if you intended to, but right now we've got this nebulous sort of milestone thing, and we've talked about this in past meetings, but it makes it hard, I think, to track what we're actually talking about releasing, because it doesn't actually correspond to any actual releases and actual repos. So what I have been proposing that we should do is just like drop the whole milestone 5 sort of nomenclature and just say like, what's the operator controller release, right? So like the last one was v0.2.0. Like if you open the issues and then click on the milestones, you'll see there's a 0.3.0 milestone, which is late by 25 days. So like that, I think, is what we should, yeah, right there, yeah. So that's what I think we should be tracking. Like, let's just use this milestone essentially in GitHub and sort of track things that way. And then, yes, there are implications on how we look at the big picture of all of the work that happens that goes into dependencies of operator controller. And we need to have an answer for that. But in my mind, like, this is probably the view that I think Kevin is sort of getting at in terms of like, we should have something show up here every 3 weeks. Is that right, Kevin?
That's exactly what I mean. And I would take it one step even further than that, which is is operator controller the only thing we want to care about? Or do we also want to have disparate releases for Ruckpack and Catalog D? Or do we want to consolidate on a similar versioning scheme and release all of them on the same cadence or something along those lines? I guess that's kind of the open question in my mind.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I don't know if I have a strong opinion on release cadence of the other projects. I think, in my opinion, it probably makes sense to try to do the same sort of thing and have something happening every 3 weeks ish. I don't know if I would say we should try to version them all the same unless we're actually going to put them in the same repo. Mainly just because, like, if one thing needs to make a breaking change in one way or needs to do a patch release in one way, it might be nice not to have all the versioning tied together. But I think a lot of the versioning is just like, because they're in separate repos, they have separate versions.
I guess that's totally fair. I don't think they need to have the same version number, but what I do think I want to understand is, like, are we trying to have a consistent minor release schedule? Is that what we're defining here? Is this a like what happens if we're going to say that we need to bump the version every 3 weeks? What's our mechanism for defining what that release bump is, and how does that relate to, like, any potential support we might have for, like, patch releases that get bug fixes pulled back to previous releases?
Yeah, my 2 cents, I would say minor releases every 3 weeks or 4 weeks, whatever we think is the right amount of time. Backporting and patch releases, in my opinion, is probably more at the community's discretion and never guaranteed.
I think that makes sense. Like asynchronous patch release, and then every 3 weeks we do a minor release for each one of the projects.
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting, I think, is, do we want to try to offset the releases somehow? Like, in theory, operator controller is going to be consuming new stuff coming from Catalog D and Ruckpack. If we synchronize the releases, then that makes the integration at the operator controller layer harder. Maybe we don't care about that because it'll just come in during the next release afterwards. So, like, yeah, we have like a sprint delay where, like, in sprint X, we're looking at X-1's versions of Ruckpack and Catalog D while we're trying to integrate. I'm not sure that matters a whole lot since we're releasing so often that it's probably not a big deal, and we can sort of handle that on a case-by-case basis or something.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard Kevin say that releases will also need to be consumed in correspondence to, if so v3.0 should be consuming v3.0 of 0.3.0 of catalog D. So I mean, even if we release at the same time, but v0.4.0 is of operator controller is consuming v0.3.0 of catalog D, I think that should be fine too.
Yeah. I was just talking about the timing of when those releases happen such that they can be incorporated into operator controller. So are we gonna release all 3 projects on the same day? Are we going to say, well, we want to release Catalog D and Ruckpack a week early so that we can incorporate any of those changes during that final week of operator controller? And I guess I'm saying, like, I don't know if we're going to be like super strict about, I mean, this is part of a discussion, I guess, but like, say we get to a release day and we've got some blocking issue. We're probably just going to say, like, okay, well, in this case, there'll be an exception. We'll wait until this blocking issue is resolved one way or the other, and then we'll cut the release. So maybe we need to revert something, or maybe we need to add something else in, but we're not going to release that day. And if you look at it from a 3 different project perspective, like, you might start getting off in terms of literally every 3 weeks. Maybe we account for that by having a shorter window the next time. I don't know, but like, I don't want to be super strict unless we think that's how it would make it easier for us.
I guess I don't want to solve for that problem unless we run into that problem. Maybe, like, if we're bumping minor versions, why would we be breaking anything anyway? Like ultimately, we're not like vendoring, right? We're just, are we vendoring? Are we vendoring?
Operator controller vendors APIs.
Right, they vendor the APIs, but those in theory should be the thing we should care about is the CRD version, right?
Yeah, which we're changing a lot. Well,
Sure, yeah, well,
I guess
still-
we're breaking the CRD often without actually changing the CRD version.
yeah, I guess like while we're still at V0, I think it makes sense maybe for us to just kind of do this on a case-by-case basis. But I would imagine that what we probably don't want to do is build a process around this, because once we get to V1 and actually release, we probably shouldn't be pushing any breaking changes to the APIs.
Yeah.
And if we do, it's a major version bump, and that's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
Through cadence.
Okay,
Yeah,
so,
totally agree.
sorry, Joe, go for it.
Nope, I was just agreeing with Kevin.
Okay, yeah, I was thinking during this conversation that I'm having a deja vu moment right now, because it feels like we've definitely talked about this at least once, if not a couple of more times, and then I feel like we've talked about this and then we've tried to adhere to the process, but it's all been very sort of abstract. So at least for the next milestones, we've discussed a few ideas over here. For example, Joe said, let's get rid of the GitHub projects milestone view and just let's use this and stuff like that. It feels like we should have all of this written down somewhere so that we have the structure placed, and then anything that needs to be changed, we first go and update that write up to make that change in process official. So does it make sense to write up this thing that Kevin, you just talked about, maybe as an RFC, or at least somewhere in the operator controller repository that says, here's the release cadence that we've decided. And then from the next milestone, we can stick with that. Probably have it highlighted in the agenda doc also, that here are the things that we're looking at next.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. My suggestion was that I was going to see kind of what people are feeling and then try to write up an RFC for release proposal, and then have everybody take a look at it, and then we can discuss at the next meeting.
Okay. So I think we should have an action item for the next meeting as release cadence. What's the spelling of cadence? Okay. Thank you. All right. Autocorrect. See. Do you want me to assign that to you, Kevin?
Yeah, go for it. Why not?
Okay, I'm just gonna put this. And then we can assign offline. Okay, so the next item in the agenda is pair with the DEPI REPL. If I'm saying it right. Pair, are you
Yeah.
here?
Yeah, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Stop sharing so that you can take over.
Okay, I will try to share, but I have had problems with this in the past. So I'm sure it's visible. Are you guys able to see anything?
We can, yes.
Yeah. Cool. Alrighty. So I wish I could pause, but I can't. So avert your gaze while I explain this, and then I'll restart it. So I just wanted to show off a little bit of work I did a few weeks back while we had shift week. So I was thinking about this problem building RFC, and I tried to implement the ideas that I had there, as well as tried to come up with a kind of REPL interface for so that we can try to play around with the concepts that DEPI creates, and hopefully be able to try and use the RFC stuff in a more practical way, although it's still not 100% there yet. So DEPI is there to basically answer the question, what bundles should we install on our system, given, the bundles available or the bundle metadata available in catalogs, cluster state, and user intents, which usually expressed through cluster state by stamping out your operator CRs and so on. And the way that we frame the question that we want to ask DEPI, meaning which bundles should I install, given all of this information, is what we've called, or what I have called in DEPI, a problem, which is a collection, is essentially a collection of variables. And a variable is one of the things that may or may not be picked by the solver. So each bundle is a variable. Each intent of the user to install an operator is a variable. Each installed bundle is a variable, and so on and so forth. And variables can each have constraints, which are used to define the relationships of these variables to other variables, as well as to the solution itself. So what I'm going to demo here, I'll restart it so we can go from the top, is just the simplest sort of hello world of Repli, where we create two variables, we assign one, we add a mandatory constraint to one of them, and we add a dependency between one of them and the other, and then we run it through the solver to see what the solution is. So the first step is to just start the REPL. Here we create a new variable called v1. We can give variables a kind, in this case it's demo, and we can pass in a dictionary of key values for metadata. So there we can see a sort of JSON representation of the variable with its ID, kind, and properties, and constraints, which we'll cover soon. So you can just as well create a variable without properties. So now we create a problem, and we will, well, I've called it here activate variable v1, but this means adding the variable to the problem. So nomenclature in UX here might still be a little bit, rough. So now we've added both variables to the problem. It might be a little bit hard to see in the JSON, but you can see the variables parameter listing two keys, v1 and v2, the two variables. We go ahead and add a mandatory constraint called m to variable v1, a dependency, constraint called dep from v1 to v2. And then finally, we can solve this problem of two variables. And again, it's maybe a little bit too quick to see, but in the response, we will have a selection. So you can see v1 was selected as well as v2. Sorry, that ended quite abruptly. And let me show something else. Just remove that to get rid of the noise. So once we pass those variables into the solver, it will make a selection between them. So we could have, for instance, added, variable 3 to the problem, but it maybe didn't have any relationship to v1 or v2. So it probably would not have, definitely would not have been selected. In this case, both variables v1 and v2 were selected because v1 was mandatory, so it must be in the solution, and it has a direct dependency to v2. Therefore, v2 must also be there. So this gives you hopefully gives you an idea for the primitives of DEPI, what a variable is, what a constraint is, what a problem is, what the solver does, and so on. And I would like to very quickly go over a couple of implementations of Sudoku. Like the details here don't matter so much. I wanted to show off a little bit the work that I did with the RFC, with the variable sources and how they work, putting problems together. So I wanted to demo here 2 ways of solving the same problem. One using a kind of a single variable source, which produces all of the variables that we need to describe the Sudoku problem. And another one which sort of weaves a few different variable sources to achieve the same goal. So here's us creating a variable source. Just let me see if I can stretch this out a little bit. A variable source has a function which gets called, and it produces variables in some form. So that's up for the variable source to do. So in terms of Sudoku, the way that we try to generate solutions for the Sudoku puzzle is we'll create variables for each of the cells, and we'll also create variables for each of the numbers in each of the cells. So this means that, you know, if you have number 1, you're gonna on the board, you're gonna have 81 possible places to put the number 1, and we're gonna basically try and pick nine of those so that they're not overlapping each other. So the first thing we do is loop over the number of rows and columns. We create a cell variable. We make sure it's we add a mandatory constraint to it. So this just means that all of the 81 cells in the board, those variables will be part of the solution. We'll see why that's important later on. And finally, we have another loop here for each of the numbers 1 to 9, or 0 to 8, as the case may be. And we create a variable for each of those positions and each of the numbers. We'll say that this is a Sudoku variable kind or type, so depi.variable.sudoku. In contrast with, sorry, I'm just using myself here. Where is it? In contrast with the Sudoku cell kind, which is depi.variable.cell. For this example, it's not that important. So now we create the variables for each of the row column numbers. And then finally, we have to establish the constraints between all of these variables. So in Sudoku, for instance, you know, the number 1 can be the only one on that row of cells. Sorry, if you pick 1 for a particular number for a particular cell, that number cannot exist on any of the cells on the row of that cell, on the column of that cell, and on one of the 9 boxes. So the first thing we do is, for the current cell that we're in, we add a conflict to all of the other 9 cells on the row, which means if this cell is number 1, the neighbor can't be 1, the neighbor of that one can't be 1, and so on both sides of the neighborhood. Similarly, we do the same for the column, so we conflict with every other same number on any cell in my column. And finally, for the remaining 4, for the particular box of the 9 boxes that make up the Sudoku board, the number should conflict with those positions as well. I wish I could run this. I just wanted to show the code, but essentially that is essentially how you express the Sudoku in SAT format. Oh, I promised I would say why that cell variable is so important. So we add a dependency. So for the cell variable, each cell variable will have a dependency constraint on the numbers 1 through 9 for its cell. So what this constraint says is basically pick a number. And the internal constraints with all the conflicts will basically define what the solution of the puzzle will be. Probably doesn't make too much sense with me going over it. If that you find this is something interesting, I suggest spend a little bit of time looking at it. So it's in the Repli hack Sudoku in my Git repo or my Git org. So now we can also see how to build this same problem, but breaking it down into different variable sources. So we would have one that produces the variables for each of the numbers, for each of the rows and columns, which was our Sudoku type variable. We can add the row, column, and number as attributes or properties to the variable. So essentially, when this variable source runs, it would just generate these however many 800 odd, 700 odd variables, and then be done. Then we'll have another one which is called for every change to a Sudoku variable, it will, which was the one created in step 1. It will extract the parameters of row, column, and number, and it will create those cell variables that we were talking about before, together with its mandatory and dependency constraints. Finally, we have another variable source for applying the row and column constraints, so the conflicts. Each cell has, or each number in its cell has with the same number in cells in the neighborhood. And finally, a last variable source for stamping out the box constraints. So then finally, when putting the problem together, we can just put all of these variable sources together and build the set of variables or the problem, which is comprised of the set of variables with constraints. Just want to see if there was one thing I wanted to call out. So this add dependency thing here might seem a little bit weird, because you might expect this variable source to be called several times, or at least one for each Sudoku variable. And it feels like this could be just overriding this pick one dependency. But with what I was trying to do with the RFC and everything, what the problem is trying to do is merge all of these changes into a consistent problem, which then gets solved. So every time we're calling an add dependency here for each variable, which is passed into the variable source for every change it picks up in the problem, it will essentially calculate the the ID of the dependency that it has, and this will essentially add a new dependency to the pick one constraint. I hope that makes sense. So this code is being called several times with a different parameter, and each time it's called, when it calls add dependency, if it already exists, if pick one already exists, it will interpret this as add this new ID to my list of dependencies. Anyway, I'm sure this was a lot. Hopefully it gives you an idea of how we can try and build these, put these problems together. I encourage everyone to play around with it. Feel free to come ask me questions upstream, downstream, whatever, and even right now. That's it. That's all I got. Thank you.
I think Varsha has her hand raised.
Yeah, I just had one implementation question, but what's the difference? What's the value of the property field in a variable source in the repli example which you said? Because I see that you're creating different variable sources in the Sudoku problem for each row and column. So in the OLM world, in the repli example, each bundle will be a variable source and the channel version would be property. Would that be converted into a specific literal for resolution, or would that be specific variable sources, like different variable sources?
So in the context of OLM, I would either expect one component that manages all the catalog source, metadata to be a variable source, or each of those catalog sources to have its own little component, which makes it a variable source. Does that make sense? So then each bundle that we get from a catalog source will be a variable ultimately. And the properties that would get stamped out there would be something akin to the bundle properties, such that other variable sources could potentially operate on them, at least in how I'm conceptualizing, how I'm building problems here, at least in the context of the RFC. Did that help answer the question?
Yeah, so just another follow-up. If that's the case, in case of the Sudoku example, can't the row and columns, instead of being variables, can't they be properties?
All right, just trying to think. So there might certainly be another correct way to build this problem. So the thing is, you can, if I would remove the mandatory constraint from those cell variables, then essentially nothing would get selected, because it will be like there are no real constraints on this set of variables. As soon as you put the mandatory on, it tells the solver this variable is going to have to be there, and then the dependency constraint says, well, one of these guys is going to have to be true, or will have to be present in the solution as well. So you're basically saying for each of the cells in the Sudoku board, pick a value from 1 until 9, right? Now, if there was a way to do it without, I'm not sure. So, and the reason is sometimes, I guess variables could, well, most of the time variables represent some domain object, but sometimes they could just be an artifice for expressing a particular constraint, if that makes sense. So if I wanted to override, like, say another variable has a dependency from bundles, I don't know, 1 through 10, but now I want to tell the resolver, no, you can only use from 1 until 3. Then I could create another variable which has a dependency on my original variable and has a dependency on bundles from 1 until 3. And that would basically force the dependency on the parent variable to be limited to the set of the dependencies in the sort of child variable, if you will, or constraint variable. Does that make any sense? It would be much easier with a whiteboard.
Yeah, I'll probably look into the implementation again, because I'm confused
Yeah.
of the fact that we are having constraints over properties in bundles, but then we are not able to have
So
constraints.
how do you mean constraints over properties and bundles?
You have a constraint that the channel should be from the channel should be stable, or say the version should be pinned to 0.x.y.
So I think the way that we're going to want to handle this, and Joe and I already had a bit of discussion about it, would be to introduce package and channel variables. So then the package variable would have a dependency on, let's say, all of the bundles that it provides, and it would have a dependency on the channels that are under it. And then maybe those channel variables have dependencies on the bundles that are within that channel. So maybe we don't need it on the package side. Maybe it's enough for packages to point to channels and channels to point to bundles. Then if you wanted to express that you select a particular channel, then that would be the same as figuring out what is the channel that represents, what is the variable that represents that channel, and adding a mandatory constraint to it.
That makes sense. It's the other way around. Instead of channel pointing to a package, it's the package pointing, channel pointing to a bundle. Sorry, bundle pointing to a channel, it's the other way around. Channel being pointed to a bundle.
Right. So, and then even if we have, so I'm just trying to think now. So even if we have a required package variable with dependencies, let's say on the bundles that fulfill it, then we would still, because the bundles would tie the required package variable and the package variable of that bundle, because they both have dependencies on those bundles. No, we said packages don't have dependencies on bundles. Sorry, this would be much easier with a whiteboard.
We might need that if we want channel to be optional.
Right. So, well, the point being that as soon as you select a bundle, if that bundle exists in another channel, no, because dependency is an implication. Implication doesn't go that way, so that should still be okay. Yeah. So then we would probably have to find the channel variable and set it to mandatory. Sorry, it's a lot of stream of consciousness stuff, so probably not that useful in the context of this meeting.
Yeah, we are also coming very close to the top of the hour, and
okay, yep. So I'll call it. If there's any other questions, let me know. We can also take them in chat, whatever.
Very quickly, Per, have you had a chance to start writing any documentation for these libraries? Because I know in V0, without documentation, it was all, let's go and find out what a variable is. I think you've talked about a lot of these concepts right now in your demo, but then with I don't think any of that is written down yet.
Yeah, no, it's not. That's definitely that's the one thing that we need to do in the very near future. I think we're still trying to reach consensus on the RFC side. At least I had a couple of discussions with Joe about it. I've written another RFC for a sort of simpler approach, but that's still kind of work in progress. I just wanted to get Joe's impression of what's there first before I put too much work into it. And then hopefully once we reach a decision on how we want to build these problems, then it's just a matter of breaking it down, and documentation tickets will be a part of that. And then I think that would be like 95% of that be done.
Okay. Yeah. We can probably talk about the documentation side at least whenever it's ready. That's similar to something like operator controller, how the documentation side is being built. Because I think dev document is going to be critical for this.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So thank you, Per. The next item is this, and I assume that this is going to take a little bit of time. Status update on the discussion around multi-tenancy for OLM v1. Do we have? It looks like Joe, you were the last one to comment on this. I don't know if you want to give any update, if there's anything more that we haven't mentioned in the previous meetings.
I don't think there's a whole lot that we've talked about. Andy and I have been tossing around sort of the first foray idea into sort of the first set of RBAC things that we're talking about proposing next, which is around how we dole out permissions for cluster/operator admins to interact with the APIs provided by the operators, right? So there's a couple of facets of RBAC stuff for operators. There's who has permission to interact with the APIs that are provided by the operators, and what permissions does the operator itself have to interact with operand stuff. So Andy and I are working on a proposal for how to handle the former one of those, right? So like, is there a nice API we can come up with that makes it easy for cluster admins to dole out permissions to users on the cluster to interact with the operator's APIs? So I think we're going to take like a very measured approach and sort of add things that we're confident in and keep iterating on things that we're not.
Is this similar to Orion operator, or is this orthogonal to?
It's similar, yeah. There's definitely some similarities, but it's not focused. So Orion is mainly focused, as far as I understand, on handing the operator permissions that it would need to interact with the operands, and we're not focused on that. But it all looks kind of the same because it's all dealing with RBAC stuff, so it won't look too different. But
Okay.
there's no real, design thought yet, other than like, here are the things that we need to be able to do. So we don't have enough down that we're ready to share a proposal yet, but we've sort of sketched out the boundaries of what we think we want to try to do next.
Okay, so I'm not sure how this action item got here. I'm guessing that in the previous meeting we talked about this and then we decided to check on this. Is it fair to say that we talked about the fact that there is some design discussion happening, but the RFC is yet to come? So RFC is yet to be written, coming soon, sort of thing. Is that fair?
Yeah. And
Okay.
it won't cover the whole scope of that. It'll just cover a piece of it.
Okay. Cool. I think that captures it so that we have captured it over here. Does anybody have any further questions on this? Okay. So I guess we'll all wait for the RFC. The next item is, oh, yeah, looks like I skipped the next milestone idea generation. It looks like there's nothing here for now, but then we did talk a bunch about release planning. And we did move some of the tickets from milestone 5 to milestone 6. Although at this point, I might be confusing the terms based on what we've discussed before. Does it make sense to skip this portion today? Go out and write the release cadence RFC, and then in the next meeting, probably discuss that? Or is there anything in this item that, in the area of this item, that anybody wants to discuss right now? Okay. So
I think what I would hope we can do, I don't know about in the next week, but maybe in the next 2 to 3 weeks, we can have some proposals written up for what we think we're going to do next. And ideally, and we've talked about this a lot too, is like make a backlog of a bunch of stuff that is not just the very next milestone. So I think Andy and I are hoping that we can put some high level proposals together, and then we can start breaking that down into what we think we can do in each milestone.
okay,
And obviously, if anybody else has big ideas or anything and wants to propose that we do something like this, release planning discussion is the place to do it. So it's not limited to just Andy and I. It's anybody in the community that has ideas. This is where we want to have those discussions.
should we check back on that in next week, or is next week too less of a time frame to check back on?
We can check back. I'd be a little bit surprised if at least if me or Andy have time to write something up there. But it's worth checking back, and we could potentially say, yeah, nothing to report yet.
Okay. Okay, I can word these better so that the next host doesn't get confused by these words. But at least that's good enough for me to record. What I want to rework the phrasing. Okay, so that's all we had for the agenda. I think to close out. Yeah, so I've created the next meeting agenda. Do we have a volunteer for next week's meeting to host the meeting?
I can run the next meeting. This is Daniel.
Cool. Okay, and then I don't have the permission for the YouTube channel. I mean the username and password. So I guess if anybody has that, please let me know. We can figure it out how to upload this recording. With that, I think that brings us to the end of our meeting. Before I stop recording, does anybody have anything else they wanted to discuss, but it's not mentioned in the agenda items? Nope. Okay, cool. So with that, I shall bang the gavel and call this meeting. And the recording's been stopped. Thank you everyone for joining. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Lonnie.